So this is Parasha Beha'alotkha, and it's June the 17th, 2024. So we just watched this clip from Raiders of the Lost Ark. For those watching the recording, I didn't put it on the recording for copyright reasons, but I'm referring to the climactic scene of the Raiders of the Lost Ark where the Ark is brought up onto a platform, and the Nazis open up the Ark lid. They find grains of sand in there, and then that's their big mistake. They play with the sand, or he has the sand pass through his hands, and that unleashes this ferocious power, this electric, pyrotechnic fireworks that literally burns holes through all of the people, incinerates them, melts them, and then incinerates them and takes they're they're vanished. And it's filled with cliches, but it's also touching on all sorts of interesting motifs within the Bible. Steven Spielberg is obviously not an idiot, and Steven Spielberg, was able to kind of layer on cliche after cliche after cliche here, and certainly, dipped into a few biblical cliches, like, for example, the Nadav and Avihu incident, which is, the coming in contact with the holy area, the holy zone, not with not without purity, and you get incinerated for that. And another episode, Uzzah, who touches the ark, and he by touching it, he gets incinerated or he's killed. And the notion, of course, that there is this unbelievable power in the object itself, and that the object itself uh, is dangerous. It will incinerate you if you come close to it. And of course, that's what happens in the movie. And it's very interesting that Indiana Jones, who is tied up to a stake, and the woman uh, are not incinerated, and that is the kind of wink, nod, wink to the idea that he is blameless, he is righteous, and of course the Nazis are the epitome of evil, and this is what's going on there in a nutshell. I mean, of course, we'll have to read the articles to get a much deeper look at it. Notwithstanding all of that, the whole it didn't it, we didn't need Steven Spielberg to illustrate for us the relationship, the legendary relationship to the Ark. That comes obviously through millennia of Jewish tradition, certainly in the Bible itself, in those cases that I mentioned, um, and it has to do, I think, with things that are encapsulated around the verse that we cited, and the verses that we cite, and the verses that we recite every Shabbat. And with that, I'm going to turn to them and we'll try and take a look at them inside. And
To trust mutual.
okay, there I go. I'm sorry about that. What am I doing? Why? How am I doing that?
Rabbi, there's another element in that film that what's his name is saying, "Don't look." So they're saved in part not just because they're not Nazis, but because they keep their eyes closed,
Right.
and
Okay.
somehow he knows that, which is like weird.
Interesting. Okay. Sorry about this. My screen is not being shared right now. Okay. Right. Let me just make sure I have. Okay. Boom. Right. This is off. Okay. No. Let's try that again. Uh, Zoom. How about this? Is that it? Ibn Saron?
Uh-huh.
Okay, I hope you didn't see too many personal things before. All right. Uh, Here we go. So, Vayibn Saron, Vayomer Moshe, Kuma Adonai, V'yafutzu oivecha, V'yanusa misanecha mipanecha, Uvenucho Yomar, Shuv Adonai Revavot Alfei Yisrael. And so it was. So and whenever the ark was to march on, the Moses would say, "Arise for battle, O God, that your enemies would scatter. those who hate you may flee before you. So the first thing I'm going to point out is that in the Torah scroll itself, this passage is preceded by one little upside down nun, and at the bottom is an upside down nun. The context, before we get to what is this, the context is Vayhi b'shana hashenit, the verses preceding this in the chapter 10. Vayhi b'shana hashenit b'chodesh hasheni b'esrim b'chodesh na'ala ha'anan. It was in the second year, in the second month, on the 20th of the month, that the cloud went up from the dwelling of the testimony, and the children of Israel marched forth on their marches. From the wilderness of Sinai, the cloud came to dwell in the wilderness of Paran. And what you get in this chapter is an entire set of instruction, a very elaborate description of the marching of Israel. We get there's a tremendous sense that what we're getting, in the literature is movement. It's the cloud goes up and the people march forward. And you feel the rumble, the thousands and teeming thousands of the people who are rumbling and moving forward on their trek through the desert. Okay, and in that context, you have the ark, and the idea is that the ark is the thing that moves forward with the people, and that is at the beginning of the movement of the people. All right, let me go back to you. All right, so here we're going to go back to the text here. Okay, we got this. All right, we'll read the text closely, and you'll see. This is Kuma Adonai, arise, God. V'yafutzu oivecha, v'yanusu misanecha mipanecha. All right, these are parallel phrases. Let your enemies, oivecha, misanecha, those who hate you, let them disperse and let them scatter. And then when the ark comes down, it's Shuva Adonai, return God, Rivavot Alfei Yisrael. And that Rivavot Alfei Yisrael means you of myriad divisions of Israel. It's a synonym for God. It means that God is like an army of hundreds and hundreds of thousands. Okay, in a way, it's a related statement to Adonai Tzvaot. Okay, as I mentioned before, I taught this passage, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot, Melech Haaretz Kevodo. We say that all the time, but the two terms are different. Kadosh, Kadosh Yisrael, is your personal relationship with the Holy One of Israel. Adonai Tzvaot is the transcendent God, God of the universe, God of myriads, okay? So what you almost have here, and I know it's a bit of a kind of shoehorn, but I'll do it anyway, which is, at the first one, it's Adonai v'yafutzu oivecha. They hate you. Those who hate you are those who do not have an intimate relationship, do not have a personal relationship with you. These are the enemies of God who are the people with whom the sacred aspect of God in both the ritual and ethical realms is not present. Okay, and Rivavot Alfei Yisrael is, you return to us God who is transcendent. What I'm saying is that we can read into something like this this idea of the personal relationship with God, and also this kind of universal, the particular and the universal. Or, what we could say as Adon Olam, God is the God of the universe, but he's Biyado Afkid Ruchi, I place my spirit in his heart, in his hand. That in a way, Judaism, becomes a religion in which, God is conceived also at the same time as the transcendent God of the universe, but also the God who cares about, you and me, right? And the people of Israel, this tiny little speck, this tiny little portion of the vastness of the universe is so important to God. And the idea that the God who's concerned about amoebas and the microorganisms and the working of the universe is also concerned with you and I. That's monotheism, right? That's really at the heart of it. And so there's a bit of that here, which is that there are people. God has this relationship with the people, and God is the God of the universe, and that God will render judgment and render protection for the people of Israel within the universe. So there is what's going on there in terms of that relationship. Um, the thing about the text is, and we don't have the way to do this, but if I were to open the scroll for you, you'd see that this text is somewhat separate from the rest of the text. Maybe I have a tikkun here. I'll just try and see if the tikkun has it written out in the tikkun, because here we go. You can see if I put this up here. This is the text is over here. This is what it looks like in the Torah. Okay, and you see that it's separated by these two nuns. This is unusual, very unusual in the Torah itself, that the Torah would separate the text. So the first thing that comes to your mind when you see something set off like that, just by your education and the way that you encounter text, what would you interpret from that? What would be the first thing that comes to your mind when you see a text that in a string of text like that, you see that broken? What would you say?
It's highlighted for some
It's a
reason.
highlight, okay? They don't have the yellow highlighter that we do, but it's a graphical way of showing that the text is this detached or unique from its surrounding text. Now, we could get into a whole conversation about punctuation and paragraphication of ancient texts. If you've seen the Torah scroll, as of course you have, you will note that there's no punctuation in the Torah. Why? Because punctuation is, in human cultural history, a relatively more recent phenomenon. The idea that you put periods and colons and commas in English, well, those did not exist in Hebrew. Uh, you have something close to that in Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew, with the word selah. Selah functions as a kind of punctuation marker in the book of Psalms, for example. We think of it as a more like responsive, choral outburst, but it may have been a punctuation. And in rabbinic Hebrew, etmaha, the word etmaha means say it with astonishment. Okay, so you'll find in the Talmud has no punctuation either, but when the rabbis want to draw a distinction to a certain phrase and punctuate it with what we would use as an exclamation mark now, or even a question, they would say etmaha, and that would be a whole word there. And so ancient texts do not have punctuation instruments. It's only a modern phenomenon, okay? Except these are not punctuations, they're more like parentheses. And parentheses means that this is a text that was probably pasted here from another source. And we have that discussion among the rabbis and certainly among people who investigate these matters, scholars. But what they're saying is that this is a text on its own. And I'll show you some of the articles on this, and what they'll say is that here's what they'll say. It's Rabbinic Midrash. This is the Midrash, uh, and the Midrash says as follows: Bar Kapara, Rabbi, made the beginning of the book of Numbers until when the ark set out. Moses would say one scroll. When the ark set out and what follows as its own scroll from there until the end of the book, one scroll, which means that there was a tradition, and still in the commentaries, that this is a separate scroll or a separate book. These two verses constitutes one book. So instead of having the five books of Moses, we should actually be speaking about the seven books of Moses, because Breshit, Shmot, Vayikra, the first part of Bamidbar, four books, this text, five books, the second part of Bamidbar, six books, and Dvarim is seven. So we have seven books. It makes it very interesting because seven books corresponds to seven branches of the menorah. That each branch of menorah really reflects a separate body of teaching in the Torah, basically. That's a nice idea. What he's really saying is that, look, I don't really know what to do with this. It's a separate text. It made its way in here. It has its own independence. What the scholars say, and this is from Jacob Milgram, he's saying here in this commentary, the Bamidbar commentary, JPS Bamidbar commentary, he is saying, this couplet, the Song of the Ark, may be a fragment of a larger saga on the life of Moses. It may have been attached here because of the association of words for travel, binisoam, binisoa, and rest, menucha and menucho, and the poem does not belong in its context as indicated by the inverted nuns that frame it. So what we have here is an idea that is fairly common in the commentaries, that something is here, that these are two verses. It may have been something from a larger poem, and what we get is just the condensed version of this. There are in the Torah and of course in the Bible references to all sorts of books outside that are not part of the Torah, which only indicate a big question, which people like Gary Rensburg investigate and other scholars, which is, where does the Torah come from? How does it come to be? And how do we get the book as a book? And since we're not an Orthodox congregation, I feel very free and able to say that whereas tradition will have the Torah being dictated to Moses from God at Mount Sinai word for word, we can say it's just a little more complicated than that the Torah comes together in a very, very complicated process over many, many centuries, and you can find evidence of where it's being stitched together and how it's being edited. And this place is actually one of those places where you can make the case that the Torah comes together as a sacred book because it's been edited from other places and other things. It's almost as if saying that there's an editor, a redactor, or maybe several redactors over several generations who are sitting somewhere with many, many scrolls or many, many texts in front of them, and they're saying, where does this go? Where does this go? How do we put this together? And anyone who's ever edited a manuscript kind of knows what this process is, and we now take it for granted. We have word processing and all sorts of technological tools in order to do that. But I'm involved in this on a regular basis, where I'm writing the Parasha sheets or writing sermons, whatever, and you cut and paste and cut and delete, etc. It used to be much more difficult when you did this by hand or with a typewriter. Many of us, of course, can remember those days when you had typewriters and you had whiteout and cartridges and all sorts of things that you did for deleting texts. I remember using a lot of Scotch tape, pasting things, writing essays for school, and cutting things up, putting them, and then having to rewrite. Now this happens really in the space of seconds, and with AI, don't even start. I've done prompts just as an exercise, an experiment with AI, to prompt the AI to produce a sermon, and within literally seconds, I get a sermon. except it's just not a good sermon. They're just very, very bad at this point. But within the space of a couple of years, once more of us feed our own sermons to the AI, whatever, we will be able to produce sermons by artificial intelligence, and people won't know. Uh, Today, you popular music, there's this phenomenon of music being produced by AI, and if you are able to listen carefully, you can tell the difference. But within a very short time, you won't be able to tell the difference, and that I think puts us at a new place in human civilization. Notwithstanding that, I think one of the interesting things that awaits us in the world of Jewish study, in the world of Bible study, and critical Bible study, is the use of AI in the study of these kinds of questions. So, if and people are talking about this already, and I'm not sure if they've already done this, where they've uploaded, or you can have the AI algorithms examine large quantities of text and show that certain texts have exhibit the same patterns grammatically, linguistically, and other things, and therefore conjecture that they belong to a certain author, a certain era, etc. That's coming. That is coming to us pretty soon. And that'll be both exhilarating for those of us who are interested in these questions, and deeply threatening to those of us who are deeply threatened by these kinds of questions. I think we have the capacity to deal with it, because we've been offering theories about this already for a couple of hundred years. So this won't be anything new. This will just be um, another source of evidence, or another source of ways of looking at the Bible text, and truly trying to decipher it, decode it, and do the detective work that's necessary in terms of trying to study it. I'll just give you another example of that. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which is there are lots and lots and lots of material, a lot of which has not been published or codified, etc. And if you got the machine, like the computer, to analyze these texts, you'd be able to show certain kinds of patterns and parallels. The same is true for the Cairo Geniza. Morty Schwartz talks about this all the time. The seminary, Morty is the librarian at the seminary. The seminary has lots and lots and lots of Geniza fragments, much of which has not been analyzed. Still, after 100 years of the Cairo Geniza, more than 100 years, and uh, by being able to have an AI program digitize them and analyze them, we'll get a lot of discoveries. Steve, go ahead. You have to unmute.
Yes. Um, just to add to what you're saying, isn't there a reference to one of these insertions to the book of the War of the Lord?
That's correct. Sefer Milchamot
Right in the
Hashem.
Torah.
It's in the Torah. Sefer HaYashar, I think, also. And Susie, you have another comment on that? Yeah.
Yeah, so just what you said about the AI, I'm not sure that it's being applied to the Cairo Geniza at this point, but there's some treasure trove of ancient documents, I think, on tablets that's now being scanned
Yeah.
and translated, because otherwise it just takes too long.
Right. No, this process is happening in scholarship in all the fields of antiquity, and we used to say we should only live to see this. Yes, we should only live, but I have a feeling that most of us are going to be alive to see these, because this is coming at exponential speed. The ability to do all of this is happening faster than we are able to think about it. Last year or 2 years ago, I was so captivated by virtual reality, the idea that we have virtual reality, And I said in a sermon, I used a sermon about the Aleppo synagogue, and you put the goggles on, and I actually had that experience at the Israel Museum. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience where you put the goggles on and you feel like you're in the space. And I said it won't be long before they take this technology and apply it to, let's say, the study of the Holocaust. And sure enough, I saw last week that there are already a virtual reality thing. It's kind of shuddering to think about that. That's what you want to represent, but the idea that you can put a pair of goggles on and walk into space and feel the virtual reality as if you're in a simulator of that is quite stark. John, go ahead. Unmute. Have to unmute yourself. Unmute. Press the button. Unmute. Pass. Yeah, okay. I know. Maybe you'll text me. You write it in the chat, and I'll read it. Okay. So
I'm okay.
now you're okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. So my question is, why is this particular text a separate book?
That is really the great question of this whole story, and I think it is because the ark takes on this, I want to say, magical, but I can't not say that. The a dimension beyond the ark. The ark captivates the imagination of antiquity to such an extent, and it's found in so many different places in the entire Tanakh in terms of its important qualities, and it becomes the center of the sanctuary. So it ends up, and this will move us into the next part of this. So thank you for the question. It ends up playing a dual role. The ark has a dual role. One is a militaristic role, and one is, of course, a religious cultic role. And those roles are somewhat incompatible. Okay, the idea that the ark would be the totem, the thing, the symbol that would go out and would be like in the movie, the Raiders of the Lost, it would exert so much power that your enemies would be dispersed from it. It's almost like a weapon in itself. It's like it radiates, radiation around it that protects the people. It's not far-fetched to think of these kinds of things even in the imagination of our ancestors, to have the idea of, we would call it a force field, but I don't these ideas, they may not have called it a force field, but zones of holiness and zones where there is something and zones where there is nothing certainly existed in the imagination of our ancestors, so that the ark plays this role as it's weaponized. Now that idea seems to be inconsistent with its religious, spiritual role, which is that it doesn't move from the Holy of Holies, and that you can't touch it, you can't take it out, because nobody could touch it, and so that's the only place where, quote unquote, the God's Spirit will reside, and it's the throne of God. And these two ideas, that the ark is mobile and the ark is stationary, are incompatible, and yet the ark idea captivates the biblical writers to a great extent. Marlene, go ahead.
And you can't get so enthusiastic that you bring a fire pan and you're not swallowed up by the earth.
Exactly. No, and so you got to take these things, seriously. Yeah. That.
But you're indicating that already in the Torah, the way of given, those zones existed.
That's correct. So there's some, what I'm going to say nicely is, there's something very confusing here. There's something going on here which reflects that there are two cores of tradition associated with this, which led the rabbis, to think and to interpret they're irreconcilable with each other, and therefore there were two of them. There was an ark that went out and an ark that stayed in. Let's jump to those texts now, and we'll see. This is in it's on the internet. Just a second. I'm going to close that for a second. I'll get this up for a second. It's in the two arks. Okay, so this is the two arks, military and ritual. Tradition and source criticism both see the two arks in the biblical text. The Ark of the Covenant, Aron HaBrit, and the Ark of Testimony, Aron HaIdut. The former accompanies Israelite troops to battle. This is what appears in our text. The latter remains in the tabernacle, serving as a seat for God's glory and revelation. So now he's going to go, and he talks about our chapter. They march from the mountain of God. This is what we quoted here. The ark leads the Israelites who follow it. Behind, Moses says, Vayibin Soaron, our text. The two verses bookend the Torah reading ceremony. We'll talk about that in a second. And now the military ark. The Torah never describes the ark serving a military function in the course of the wars fought in the Negev against Arad, or in the Transjordan against Sichon. We have wars that go on in the Bible, later on in the book of Numbers. The ark is not found there, but you do find the ark elsewhere, and you find it referred to, for example, here. When some groups want to break away, defiantly they march toward the crest of the hill country, the Mapilim, though neither the ark of God's covenant nor Moses stirred from the camp. And the Amalekites and the Canaanites who dwelt in the hill country came down and dealt them a shattering blow. So the ark doesn't go with this group. This group, after the debacle of the spies, they want to go up to the land of Israel, but the ark doesn't go with them, and they get basically routed, destroyed. The implication here is that had it been a campaign sanctioned by God, the ark would have accompanied them in battle, and that this is what Moses means by God not being in their midst. Now we have this wonderful story in the book of Samuel where they're waging an incessant war against the Philistines, and what happens? If you remember, the Philistines defeat the Israelites in the first battle, and here the troops sent men to Shiloh, and they brought down from there the Ark of the Covenant of God, the host dwelling among the Kruvim. There, Eli's two sons, Hophni and Pinchas, were in charge of the Ark of the Covenant. When the Ark of the Covenant of God entered the camp, all Israel burst in a great shout so that the earth resounded. The Philistines were aware of the fame of the Ark and reacted accordingly. The Philistines heard the noise of the shouting, and they wondered, why is there such a loud shouting? And when they learned that the Ark of God had come to the camp, the Philistines were frightened. The gods have come to the camp. They cry, woe to us. Nothing like this has ever happened. Woe to us. Who will save us from the power of these mighty gods? These are the same gods who struck the Egyptians with every plague. Brace yourselves, be men, O Philistines, you will become. In this story, the Philistines triumph anyway. This is a sign God's displeasure with Israel. And what happens is the ark gets captured. And when it's captured, it causes all sorts of bad things to happen, and it then goes back to the Israelites. Okay? So all of this means that the ark goes in and out of battle with the Israelites, and sometimes terrible things happen, including when with David. I'm not going to do that. He says it's a reference in the book of the second Samuel to the ark, and Israel and Judah are dwelling in booths, and my master Job and your master's men are camped in the open. How can I go home and eat and drink and sleep with my wife? As you live by your very life, I will not do this. This is a reference to the idea that the people are at war and the ark is out. And I can't, Uriah the Hittite says, I can't go be with my wife while we're in such a state of emergency. That's the ark, the military ark. There are different examples of that the ark goes in before Israel in battle. What's the priestly ark? This image of a battle ark contrasts with Exodus 25, where the ark is first introduced. God commands Moses to tell the Israelites to build a tabernacle, and the ark is one of many pieces of furniture inside the tabernacle, alongside a table, a lamp, etc. And it says at the end, place the cover on the top of the ark, and after depositing inside the ark of testimony that I give you. The ark is a receptacle of a dut. The kaporet is designed to be a place of revelation. You put the two tablets of God's Decalogue in the ark. And that's where God will meet with you, and the verses indicate that. When Moses went into the tent of meeting to speak with him, he would hear the voice addressing him above the cover that was on top of the Ark of the Covenant, or the Ark of Testimony. Al Aron Haidut mibein shnei hakruvim. Excuse me. The tabernacle houses the deity, more specifically the deity's glory and presence, kavod. Whenever the tabernacle is stationary, God's kavod is occupying. So that's the glory of God fills the tabernacle. So we get that picture that the ark is in the center of the Holy of Holies, and when it's stationary, that's where God is. Okay, and we have other verses to that extent. So here's the traditional solution. It's not one ark; it's two arks. The tension between the two descriptions of the ark was noticed by the rabbis. And here we say, Rabbi Judah ben Lakish says there were two arks. One of them would go out with them to war, and the other would remain with them in the camp. The one that went out with them to war had a scroll, as it says, the Ark of the Covenant of God was traveling before them. The one that remained with them in the camp had the tablets, the broken tablets also. Neither the Ark of God's covenant nor Moses stirred from the camp. And the same solution appears in the 3rd century in the Sifrei, where it says, the rabbis say there was only one ark, and once it was taken out in the days of Eli, and it was captured. Okay? The dissenting opinion. That means there was only one ark. So they have a debate about this. And so what he does, this author, says that we have two sources, that the text itself is a composite of a priestly source and a non-priestly source. The priestly source wants to have the ark demilitarized and non-weaponized and maintained as a symbol of God's presence. And the other source weaponizes the ark and militarizes the ark and probably reflects, I guess, a more primitive state of the people and has this ark as the ark going out, okay? And what we have, he gives us a long list of different names of the ark, okay? And it invites us into a whole conversation about the different, I'm going to stop it here because it's a long conversation, a conversation about what's going on here and the evolution of Judaism and, the unity of the Bible text in terms of trying to coalesce two very, very different images of this ark, one being military and one being more ritual, and trying to reconcile the discrepancies of that, and trying, I think, also at the very core, and this is probably the bigger question, how do you reconcile this whole idea with monotheism altogether, and that God is invisible? And so the way that we interpret this is that the ark is not God. The ark is simply the footstool. It is a symbol of something that represents something larger. And that, what you saw in Raiders of the Lost Ark at the beginning, this is, imagery, and this is, the stuff that appeals to the more, I guess, the unsophisticated mind. That is to say, just as magic does. And we're always, religion's always got to appeal simultaneously to people who are sophisticated and unsophisticated. The sophisticated people get it, right, without recourse to all the comics and all the imagery. Unsophisticated people will see it very literally. And because religion has to speak to multiple layers of intelligence and multiple layers of interpretation at the same time, we're able to cohere from this one picture. All of this brings me back to the final question, which is, so what is it doing in the service? Why is it that these verses, and we have elaborate pageantry surrounding the singing of this verse, right? The Torah, this is the high point of the service. Shabbos morning, you start off with those verses. In one tradition, it's that way. In another, in the Sephardic tradition, there are different verses. And then we go, Vayhi ben Aharon, Vayomer Moshe. And that is when the ark is open. The person is honored to pull the curtain. And why? And then, of course, when the Torah comes back into the ark at the end of the service, we say Uvenucho Yomar, and we put the Torah back in the ark, and the person that's honored with closing the ark will close the ark, and we'll sing these verses, and it's really the high point of the service. What's going on? Okay, so the first thing I'll ask is, to the best of our knowledge, where does this emerge historically in the development of Jewish liturgy? Best I can tell through my my own library at home is that this comes from a 13th century figure. The first reference to this is by a figure named Rabbi Aaron of Lunel. Rabbi Aaron of Lunel, ben Meshulam, Jacob of Lunel. He is this French Jewish ritualist who flourished about the end of the 12th century in Lunel. And where is Lunel? I'll show you where Lunel is in a second. Lunel is in the south of France, and those of you who get to go on vacations can go see Lunel. All right, it is right here where this red dot is, near Montpellier in the south of France. I'm going to just try and shorten it. Right here near Monaco and Marseille on the southern coast, right? So this figure who lives there in the 12th century, he is the one where Aaron Meshulam ben Meshulam of Lunel is in his book. He writes about this as a custom that when we take the Torah out, we recite these verses. So my elementary question is, why? Why would he add this to the service? And my elementary answer is because it's not that he wants to invoke the God of the testimony, it's because he wants to invoke the God of protection. This strikes me as a particularly diaspora way of creating security around the most important moments of your service, and that you're encoding in this ritual the sense of divine protection. When you think about it, it kind of I'm layering on this things that are total speculation, but the speculations come from just one kind of reading, which is that Jews who live in medieval France in the 12th century are probably much more vulnerable than other people, considering that in those years, these are centuries which witness persecutions and the Crusades. So here you are at the moment where you are taking the Torah out, or your moment where you're about to read the Torah, which is the central part of Jewish religious life, and you are at the most vulnerable. So at the most vulnerable moment, you want to invoke as much protection as possible. And the protection that you're invoking is the military protection, the ark as the military. Now, the ark, it used to be in antiquity that a scroll was placed in a box and that the box moved around. But as Jews developed their synagogue architecture, the ark became, in an apse, and whether Christians borrowed that or Jews, whatever. there was a central focal point which held the books, held the scrolls, and that the central moment of the service is a moment where the scroll comes out of the ark, which is akin to the representation of the divine word coming out of Sinai. So, as we recall, every time we take the Torah out, we are trying to invoke Sinai. And by reciting this, we're also invoking Israel as the desert. But look what's happening liturgically on many, many layers. One layer is, so we are the desert people. We are the people that are in the diaspora. We are the people that are wandering. And we are the people that is in a constant state of formation as we move towards the promised land. And we are constantly trying to reimagine ourselves as the people of Israel in the desert, because that's the formative period. So we're in a permanent state of our formative period. Okay? That's number one layer. Number two layer is that we're in a permanent state of vulnerability as being the minority people in foreign lands, and therefore we need to rely on divine assistance. And the way to rely on divine assistance is to summon the God that is represented in that ultimate kind of nuclear force that will radiate power to everything around it. And that if we understand the Torah as having this kind of infinite power, and that God is protective of Israel, we can be experiencing a sense of God's protection every time we read the Torah, every time we take it out of the ark, and every time we put it back. In other words, at the high points of the liturgical week or the liturgical events of the synagogue. And that's what's going on here. So when we invoke these things, what Rabbi Aaron of Lunel was doing, or what he was coding in his book, which may have been because it was already being done, is saying we're tacking on these ideas in an evolving tradition. What I find very interesting here is that the Wikipedia article calls him a ritualist, and I read that with a kind of grain of salt, which means that he's inventive, and that rituals start with inventions. Okay, the rituals respond to necessities of the hour, where creative individuals come together and they create something new and they invent something, and depending on whether or not it holds, it will become widespread. I'll give you an example. My own accessible example is Yom HaShoah, where we literally invented something. We invented rituals. Does it take on? Will it become public or dispersed or popular? It only is that it's only about marketing. It's how well you distribute that, how well you disseminate that, and Jews do that. How about the Miriam's cup, the Miriam's cup at the Seder? Who ever heard of a Miriam's cup at the Seder? Well, the Miriam's cup at the Seder is an invention of the last 4 decades. With feminism and popularization of rituals. And so feminist Jews decided that they wanted to have a way to invoke the presence of women at the Seder. So they invented a Miriam's cup, and that's it. And depending on how widely dispersed it is and how widely disseminated it'll be popular or not. Some Agadot included, some Agadot don't include it, and on and on and on it goes. We go to John, then Bob. Go ahead.
Well, speaking about the militarization of the ark and invention, I thought of another one. How about the golem?
The golem is a perfect example. The golem is a folklore example, but the golem, commands attention because it's associated with this legendary individual, Rabbi Yudah, the Maharal of Leib of Prague, and who knew evidently the power of God's secret name and placed it in this lump of clay, and that became a kind of folkloristic symbol. And I'm sure it's linked to all sorts of other folklore myths that you find in medieval Europe. Notwithstanding, it became the protective, agent of the Jews of Prague and many other places. Bob, we lost your video, but you have your hand up.
Oh, let me see if I can get it back. There I am. Thanks.
Yeah.
I wanted to offer another perspective that perhaps will resonate with much of what you've said. I heard an interesting commentary recently on these issues we're talking about, and the folks distinguished, if you think of a 2 by 2 table, where on one side you have internal and external, and the other side you have offensive and defensive. The people here were saying that we're constantly engaged in different types of wars. There are external wars and there are internal wars, particularly against Lashon Hara. And similarly, in terms of battles, there are offensive battles and defensive battles. And so rather than thinking of two different arcs, there could also make an argument that it's one arc, but that it has different purposes, whether one is dealing with an external enemy or an internal enemy. And then do we go out prospectively and fight that, or do we defend through teshuva or through other things? And so it's a very interesting commentary that doesn't necessarily have to reconcile two different perspectives, but they live with each other.
So I think we're on to something. It's so interesting. I pulled some comments out of this. This is the JPS commentary on the Book of Numbers, and you would think that he would give a place for the idea that there are two arcs. That became a traditional way of dealing with it, and he doesn't. And I think the reason why he does this is because he wants us to think that there's really one, and that it's a much more difficult mental, philosophical, theological problem to reconcile these disparities as it is to separate them. It's easy to separate them. It's easy when you have a problem that seems irreconcilable, you go to the easiest solution, which is it's irreconcilable. So therefore, there must be, in this case, two. It must be one here and one there. The only thing is that the Torah doesn't say that, and the Torah wants you to have the idea that there's one, and two arcs is problematic because that leads to a certain dualism. There's not only two arcs, but there's two tents. It becomes very, very complicated. The heavier lift, Bob, is what you're trying to do here, and I think that's really what's in store for us. I mentioned Kadosh, 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 and Reitzvot, and the idea is we're always doing the heavy lift in Judaism. We're always trying to reconcile what may seem irreconcilable, a personal God with a universal God, a particularism with a kind of universalism. These may seem to be irreconcilable. And of course, lots of Judaism consists of positions that are opposite from each other. The arguments of Hillel and Shammai themselves sometimes are irreconcilable, and we are living, at any moment in Jewish history, especially, in the present moment, there are plenty of fissures within the Jewish people that may themselves be irreconcilable. How can you be one people when, and just fill in the blank and think of all the things that divide us? And so this is, I think, the genius of Judaism. The genius of Judaism is to say we are capable of reconciling irreconcilable things. That's the faith. The faith is that there's so many things that divide us. They divide us politically, they divide us theologically, they divide us ideologically, and yet we can still be one people and live with a kind of overriding sense of achdut, of unity, despite all of the divisiveness in us. I think that idea is present already in the Bible, because the Bible, by placing all of these different ideas within the same scroll, says really the biggest story, which is there's a place for everybody. There's a place for irreconcilable differences within the scroll. From one side of the scroll to the other side, there's a lot of different voices. They're all there in the same. So therefore, if the scroll can have different voices, the people could have it. The people, if the scroll could be at peace with itself, so can you. And this is a good way. Alana, go ahead.
It reminds me when they were in the desert and they were, I don't know if it was with the Midianim or with the Amalek, that Moshe, it's psychological, it gives you strength, like having the Aaron, the one Aaron or two Aaronot, like Moshe wanted to lift his arms
Yeah.
up high and he couldn't do it, so Yoshua and somebody else were helping, but it gives you strength to feel that you're connecting with God.
Yeah.
So in the time of wars, on Aedut, on a Brit, and some connections, it's very psychological.
Indeed, indeed. I think these symbolic things are very, very important. And look, here today, obviously Israel at war. These, idea of symbolism and what is symbolic to people to the sense, that they're not alone, that there's God is with them, prayer is with them, etc. These are very, very important things. Eva, go ahead.
Now, I have a question. Was there the original ark, was it in the second temple or it was reconstructed for the second temple purposes?
So I'm not sure if this is correct, but in the second ark, the Holy of Holies is empty. There's no ark already. Once the first temple is destroyed and all of these things are carted off, do they exist anymore? And we don't know. What we do know is that the menorah exists because you have a depiction of the menorah on the Arch of Titus. But to my recollection, you don't have a depiction of the ark on the ark. You would think that if the Romans had captured the ark of the covenant, they would have depicted it in the Arch of Titus, and they don't. They simply depict the menorah and other what other things. You have in the book of Esther, you have this idea the kelim mekelim shonim, that Achashverosh in the Persian court has all sorts of different vessels, and the reason why he has all these vessels is because they're stolen from the temple. That's a nice midrash, but it's we don't know. And then of course there are legends that pop up, urban legends and other kinds of that the Ark of the Covenant is somewhere in the Vatican Library, and it exists, right? Or that it's somewhere in Ethiopia and all that, and it's in some place that's sealed off by some family of priests that have kept it secret for generations. And look, that's how it captivates the imagination. Who knows? Who knows? You need a Steven Spielberg or a Harrison Ford. You need fiction to represent things that are truths within human beings. That is, we wouldn't it be interesting to see this? Wouldn't it be interesting to go to a museum and to actually see this debate? That would be a blockbuster of an exhibit. Susie, go ahead.
Yeah, a friend of mine many years ago was in, I guess it was Prague, and to the shul where
The Altonoy Shul, yeah.
where the golem is supposed to be.
Yeah.
So
Right, and so you're not allowed up in the attic.
right. So she asked the caretaker about it, and he wouldn't let her in there.
Of course.
And the same thing for, I think there's somebody in Ethiopia claims to have the ark, but nobody's allowed to go in there. It sort of begs the question as if something is really there, I think.
Well, sure. Look, in the end, it's I don't know if it's Josephus, I don't know if it's a Talmudic legend, but So what happens when they finally go into the Holy of Holies? The who is it? Um, they go in and they go in. They see it's an empty space, right? There's nothing there, and so it elicits a kind of ridicule among the enemies. But it's very profound for us that the space is empty. Why would that make theological sense? Because nothing can represent God. Okay, it's the same thing in the movie, and I think the movie kind of winks to this, which is they open up the ark, right? You saw that beautiful scene, so they take the lid off, and you all know, everybody knows, don't take the lid off, don't take the lid off the thing, because when you take the lid off, it's going to unleash all sorts of power, and so. That's what, and you see sand in there, and so you think, oh well, it's the disintegrated, 10 Commandments. No, it's nothing. There's nothing in there. But the nothing is great power. And that's the point. Right? It's a mystery. It's a mystery. And with that, my friends, we'll have to conclude. It's a mystery. We've just scratched the surface on all of these stories, but you can see how deep they take us. And maybe they answer some of the deepest questions that we have. Anyway. So have a wonderful, wonderful summer. Look forward to seeing you in shul. The Parsha talk is going to keep going, so you can dip into that with my colleagues and I, and we look forward to seeing you back sometime in the fall. Okay? So,
נסיעה טובה.
toda rabah.
Thank you.
קיץ טוב,
Thank you.